Until now, my studies of 2001 have all concentrated on the hidden narrative, which is evident in non-verbal details of the film. However, recently I've watched 2001 again with a more specific interest in the surface narrative, the one that Kubrick was willing to explain in interviews, though he also said that this narrative was the film's simplest level. Way back before I had any idea that there was a deeper side of 2001 that had to be decoded by the viewer, it was already one of my favourite movies on account of the surface narrative alone. Watching it in my early teens, I was mesmerised by the bizarre visuals, the unusual storytelling, the grandiose evolutionary themes, and especially the very unsettling Stargate journey near the end. This sequence made me feel kinda dizzy, both in terms of the trippy visuals and the what the hell is happening break in the plot structure. Other viewers of the film have described to me their own feeling of being made to feel uneasy by 2001, whether they were fans of the film or not. Some have told me they found the film scary. That's right, scary, almost like a horror film. Rewatching the film recently myself and paying attention to my emotional response to the narrative instead of intellectualising it all, I once again felt a pervading sense of unease, particularly when watching this movie alone at night with the lights off. At the same time, Kubrick, interviewed about this film, made a statement of optimism regarding the terrifying vastness and indifference of the cosmos. However vast the darkness, we must supply our own light. So for this video, I'm going to explore what I now consider to be existential horror elements in the surface narrative of 2001, and I must state right off the bat that I'm very familiar with the novelisation by Arthur C. Clarke, which was written under Kubrick's supervision and is mistaken by some to be a complete explanation of the movie. Kubrick was shooting stuff and showing some of it to Clarke, who was then writing in response to it. This is explained in some of the best biographies on Kubrick. The film isn't so much based on the book as the book is based on the film. I've been through the novel with a fine-tooth comb, and while it certainly has many interesting elements that shed light on some aspects of the movie, it does not contain all the answers as to what the movie is about. Chunks of the novel are incredibly different to the movie, in fact sometimes in opposition to it. If you don't believe me, then check out this quote from Kubrick himself. I think that the divergences between the two works are interesting. Actually, it was an unprecedented situation for someone to do an essentially original literary work based on glimpses and segments of a film he had not yet seen in its entirety. So there you have it. As for the original short story that very loosely inspired the movie, again that was by Arthur C. Clarke, that story is so different and so much shorter that it also fails as an attempt to explain the movie. The novelisation also lacks many of the film's most emotionally powerful elements, such as the bizarre musical score, the jarring fisheye lens views, the colour filter of certain shots, and the film has entire sequences that aren't in the book at all. These elements are unique to the cinematic experience of 2001, and so they need to be explored on their own merit. Having said all that, biographies on Kubrick revealed that he not only engaged in regular correspondence with Arthur C. Clarke about how the novel was progressing in parallel with the film production, but that Kubrick also had authorization rights. In other words, if there was a difference of opinion between Clarke and Kubrick regarding the novel content, then Kubrick had the final say. And so the novelisation carries as much of a Kubrick imprint as it does the official author, Arthur C. Clarke. So I will be making occasional references in this study to the novelisation. Alright, so I'm going to go through the movie and give a roughly chronological commentary on how I perceive the surface narrative, with emphasis on emotional responses to the existential horror element. Starting off the movie, we're played the first 3 minutes of György Ligetti's orchestral piece called Atmospheres. This is played as an overture. Not being a musician personally, other than little dabbles with electronica software, I think it's best for me to offer this comment from Ligeti himself regarding the style of music that he created for this piece. Quote, "Technically speaking, I have always approached musical texture through part writing. Both Atmospheres and Lontano have a dense caconic structure, but you cannot actually hear the polyphony, the canon. You hear a kind of impenetrable texture, something like a very densely woven cobweb. I have retained melodic lines in the process of composition They are governed by rules as strict as Palestrina's or those of the Flemish school, but the rules of this polyphony are worked out by me. The polyphonic structure does not come through, you cannot hear it, it remains hidden in a microscopic underwater world, to us inaudible. I call it micropolyphony, such a beautiful word." End quote. Perfect. If Kubrick ever read that description, it must have resonated with him, because 2001: A Space Odyssey, especially its ending, seems to follow the same creative approach, except in movie form. We're baffled by multiple overlapping sensory patterns that seem to lack structure, yet we feel like there is some sort of hidden structure beneath it all. So anyway, Atmospheres is an unsettling piece of music on account of its lack of consciously recognisable melodies, but it also strikes me as sounding like it's being played in a huge cavernous space or in a void. It perhaps would have been striking if Kubrick had combined this music with opening shots of the constellations, of galaxies, of moons and planets, given that they too exist in an unimaginably vast open space. However, such displays of the cosmos would have involved at least some sense of orientation and a sense of visual beauty, but Kubrick doesn't even give us a handful of stationary pinpoint stars to latch onto. We just have blackness. He makes us listen to this haunting, seemingly structureless piece for 3 minutes as we stare at a black screen, nothingness. So right off the bat, this movie makes me feel alone and lost in the darkness for a full 3 minutes. We haven't even had a title screen yet, which would at least say to us, hey, you're now watching a movie production. 2001 isn't the only movie to play music to its audience over a black screen before the titles kick in. It's known as an overture, and generally they're used to set the emotional mood of a film. Sometimes it's done with a black screen, sometimes a still image is used, such as at the beginning of the movie Oliver. But the rare black screen parallel examples in other movies are worth exploring in terms of the emotional tone of the music played. Star Trek The Motion Picture plays a gorgeous, uplifting overture piece by Jerry Goldsmith before the titles begin, setting a tone of beauty and love, even though much of the film has overlaps with the grandiose darkness of 2001. See my video on Star Trek The Motion Picture for more about what a fine movie that is. But from what I've seen, most movie overtures are positive in tone, or if they're dramatic, they at least have some recognisable structure and an accompanying visual usually. The dark science fiction movie The Black Hole, which, while being a family sci-fi entertainment movie in the mould of Star Wars, strangely has sequences that mirror 2001: A Space Odyssey, its opening music is bombastic and dramatic, with an infinite grid plane stretching across the universe and sucking us into a geometric tunnel. But this is nowhere near as unnerving for me as 2001's Ligeti overture played on a totally black screen. Scary music by Ligeti will be used in other scenes of 2001, but also Kubrick used part of Ligeti's Lontano in his horror movie The Shining, along with equally scary music by Penderecki. In fact, the creepy soundtracks of 2001 and The Shining both achieve a similar sense of unease. Here, I'm just going to swap the soundtracks over for a couple of brief clips, just to show you what I mean. Anyway, back to 2001. After making us feel uncomfortable and disorientated with Ligeti's Atmospheres, the film switches tone completely to a much more structured and uplifting piece, the opening section of Richard Strauss's Thus Spake Zarathustra. Now we could go into one about religious history relating to Zarathustra, or into the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche and his famous phrase, God is dead, but you can easily go read up on those things yourself. A lot of what I'm going to talk about in this video will overlap with those ideas anyway. It is worth noting though that the portion of Strauss's piece being played here is called Sunrise, and it's certainly no accident that we see a sunrise in this shot. But also interesting to me is that we shouldn't be able to see the details of the moon's surface here. Not only are we looking at the moon from behind it, but also the moon is in the shadow of the Earth. This is actually an eclipse. We shouldn't be able to see the details of the surface, just as we can't see the details of Jupiter in the sun crescent shots later in the film. Now, I'm going to go slightly intellectual on this point, as there's a fascinating take on this that I'd not picked up on before. I'm going to argue that the moon is slightly lit here because we are viewing this from the position of the luminous star child who we will see at the end of the movie, and who will be presented with the same uplifting music. And so the moon is being faintly lit by the star child here. The giveaway is that the sun rises over the arc of the Earth's surface to look upon the moon, and so the moon was actually eclipsed in darkness, and the sunrise is in precise alignment with us rising over the arc of the moon. The sun shines upon the moon at the same time as we rise to view the Earth. The sun and our star child view are mirroring each other. In support of this metaphor of enlightened beings as stars or suns, I refer you to the introductory statements of the 2001 novelization. This intro is cited as being from Clarke and Kubrick, by the way. The very opening lines state a specific parallel between stars and individual human beings. Quote, "Behind every man now alive stands 30 ghosts, for that is the ratio by which the dead outnumber the living. Since the dawn of time, roughly 100 billion human beings have walked the planet Earth." Now this is an interesting number, for by a curious coincidence there are roughly 100 billion stars in our local universe, the Milky Way. So for every man who has ever lived, in this universe there shines a star. End quote. So we have a metaphor right there as people as stars or suns, and this film will end with an evolved character referred to at the end of the novelization as the star child. That's all getting a bit too intellectual though for what I want to explore in this video. On the most basic emotional level, we're panning from a cold, barren moonscape here to the warmth and glory of the sunrise. This is important. The emotional structure of the whole movie has been encapsulated in about the first 5 minutes of this movie. The feeling of being lost and alone in utter darkness during the overture, to being uplifted and enlightened by the sunrise titles. The rest of the movie will play to the same emotional structure, but in much more complex forms. Next up, a series of still landscape shots which seem to depict different stages of sunrise. No music here, but there's a barrage of insect and bird noises that sounds a little bit too lush for the barren landscape that we're seeing. Sounds more like what we'd hear in a forest or jungle. But the noise of life starts to fade away as the sound of hollow winds kicks in and we cut to high altitude views of lifeless rock faces against vast skies. The shots are all stationary until this one, which very slowly pans up, allowing us to view the vast openness of the barren landscape. Combined with the hollow winds, this feels cold and empty. Rather than being a world full of thriving life, these landscapes seem hostile to life. Vegetation is very sparse. And right as the horizon becomes visible here, a distant bird call echoes, emphasizing the sense of a vast open space again. And then we cut to the skull of a large dead animal, and with no insect or bird noises, just the hollow wind and grey coloration, a deathly image. Looks like an elephant skull actually. The tusks are important here, I think, because they're weapons, showing that violence is built into the evolution of creatures here. Now we see bones in another vast, barren, stationary landscape, this time a tapir skull on the left. That's the long-snouted creatures that we'll see shortly. But look at those other bones. That's a primate, isn't it? For all we know, it could be human. We cut from this to the ape men. Presumably, these are bones from one of their previous generations. So what have we got so far? A barren, hostile, imposingly large landscape, only barely hospitable to life. There's evidence of death everywhere in the form of bones. We've already seen the fate of these primates in the shot that preceded them. The apes are picking away at scraps of food as that hollow wind carries on blowing, and though they seem fairly close up here, they are dwarfed by the vast landscape behind them, and a giant shadow looms over them, blocking out the sunlight. That large rock structure is an odd choice in the shot as well. Now the tapirs are living the same life as the ape men. Their existence also mostly consists of searching for scraps of food, a few little shrubs, and just one pitifully sized tree with not much in the way of leaves on it. And then shots of the apes and tapirs living in their parallel existence, annoying each other in competition for morsels of food. And in various shots, bones among them, probably from previous generations of each species. Remember this line which I already quoted from the novelization. It's the very first sentence in the book, and it says, "Behind every man now alive stands 30 ghosts, for that is the ratio by which the dead outnumber the living." Our Earth is, in a way, a giant graveyard of our many ancestors. We don't recognise this so much though today because we bury our dead underground, and arguably we try to bury our awareness of inevitable death with them. Now, to my knowledge, apes tend to have lived and evolved in jungle areas. This desert savanna context seems a bit out of place for them, though ape men may have actually lived in such places, but I think the barren setting is emotionally fitting for this story. A tropical jungle would depict a lush place full of food and life, but this film isn't about that. We're watching a story of evolution against the odds. So accordingly, our ape ancestor protagonists are seen barely hanging onto the evolutionary ladder by their fingernails. There's not much time to think and grow here because life is a constant search for tiny scraps of food in a desolate terrain just to sustain their very existence. There's no flowers, no waterfalls, no patches of lush forest on the horizon for these apes to look to for hope. The inevitability of death awaits with the remains of past generations on display as a constant reminder, and death can come out of the blue. As this ape takes a deathly neck bite, we fade to the black void of nothingness. How appropriate. Next scene, and we have the apes doing their usual 24/7 hunt for food morsels, and a couple of them arguing over a pitifully small pool of water. Not sure why there's a pool of water here when the rest of the landscape is dry, but realism isn't the point. This is all symbolic of the constant struggle for survival. But now we have another surprise attack scenario. This time it's not by a leopard, but by a rival ape group, who are referred to in the novelization as the Others. The Others win this fight by fear-inducing gestures rather than actual violence. Our group give up their water source quite easily, not even giving a fight really. In fact, I think the scared protagonist clan here actually outnumber the Others, yet they turn tail and run anyway. And at the end of the scene, two of the Others look toward the camera position, to us the audience, and shout a threat for us to get lost as well. And we obey by fading to black. So the scarcity of resources in a big hostile environment are a problem for the protagonist ape clan, but fear is also a problem for them. Fade into the next part of the story, a desolate landscape shot, not much to see at all, but we can hear the growl of the leopard, which carries into the next shot. A rock formation with what appears to be a cave entrance, and from this we cut to the leopard itself gloating over its latest kill. The shining eyes are important here, we'll come back to that much later in this study. I assume that either the leopard or one of the ape clans has this cave as its home. In the novelization, the protagonist ape clan live in a cave, but they're not in the cave here because, following these dusk shots, the apes are sat in a more vulnerable place. Actually, what I think's going on here is the apes have been driven away from their pool of water by the Others, and they've been driven away from their cave by the close proximity of the leopard. This is important. They sit here in fear of death, listening to the leopard growling somewhere nearby, and nearly all of them are silent for fear of drawing attention from the beast. One of them shows potential by growling back at the predator, while another has wedged himself between rocks for protection and two nearby cradle a baby ape. This is what the next generation have to look forward to. the cycle of fear and struggle to barely survive. The blood-red last dusk precedes what is likely a disturbed night's sleep for them all. Now the apes are woken by something alien to their existence, but before the object is shown to us, the emotional tone of fear, confusion and disorientation is established by the score, which is part 2 of Ligeti's composition called Requiem. This piece of music has always sounded to me like the soundtrack of tormented insanity. It has layers upon layers of voices and instrumentation that overwhelm the listener, and it has a vast cavernous feel to it. With the emotional tone of fear established, now we're shown the source object, which is designed not by natural forces but by intelligence. It may be extremely simple geometry, but geometry is something the apes have never experienced. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but the notion of straight lines seems to me a product of the human mind, or of any intelligent mind. Nature seems to have everything exist in curves and arcs of rotation. The supposedly straight horizon we see on Earth is actually the curve of our planet. Our planet, and thus everything on it, rotates around the sun. The sun rotates around the galaxy. Even light particles don't necessarily travel in completely straight lines. Astronomers have found instances of light being bent in its path by the gravity of massive stars. Even the light that we see from distant galaxies is time distorted because that light took millions or even billions of years to get here. In other words, when we see distant galaxies, we're seeing them as they were billions of years ago. Since then, those galaxies have moved, but we can't see them because the light emitted by them today won't hit this planet Earth until we are long dead, and by then our galaxy and solar system will have moved a great distance too. And of course there's black holes, which have such gravity that they pull all nearby light off course and trap or consume it. So you could say that all straight lines, if allowed to continue endlessly, would eventually curve or come full circle on account of the gravitational forces of the universe. And when we see straight lines printed on paper, or even on the very edge of the most industrially precise edges of things we manufacture, if you actually get in there with a microscope and look up close, they're not straight lines at all. They're broken and twisted at the microscopic level. If you look even closer to the atomic level, it's all positrons and electrons orbiting them just as planets orbit stars. No straight lines when you get down to that level. The notion of straight lines, as far as I can tell, is effectively a perceptual construct of human beings, which we use as an organising principle in how we grow produce on farms, how we design containers, the TV screens we watch, the paper we write on, in which we write our written dialect in straight lines. The letters themselves include straight lines, and on it goes. But perhaps the most important is the tendency of humans to now live inside unnatural cubes, which we call houses. So these apes, on the most basic sensory level, have been introduced here to the organising principles of lines, corners and boxes, and it freaks them the hell out. But eventually they overcome their fear and admire the precision of geometrical design. And now, a sunlight alignment occurs in parallel with the opening shot of the movie. As for the music, I always got the faint impression here that it isn't just a musical score, but that the object here is singing hypnotically to the apes. This is what happens in the novelization. It emits a, quote, simple, maddeningly repetitious vibration, end quote, which grows louder and more insistent. So yeah, I think the music here in the film is supposed to be the sound of the monolith. The monolith will appear 4 times in the movie, and in the first 3 instances, this same piece of Ligeti music is heard. Oh, by the way, the feeling of something unnatural going on here seems to be enhanced by the unnatural lighting. We can see that the sun is yet to rise in the distance, but the monolith and apes are lit by some other unnatural source, like a spotlight way above. An abrupt cut back to shots of the landscape in almost total silence. This time the terrain looks even more barren and less hospitable than the ones that we saw when the apes were introduced to us. There's a dominance of giant shadows in some of these shots. I think the even more barren appearance is on account of the apes having lost their precious water source, and their cave, symbolic of their even worse situation. And we cut back to the very location where a leopard killed an ape earlier. This seems to imply that sudden death still awaits, as does the presence of bones and skulls. And there's an ominous bird call here. Sounds like a standard harbinger of death. So one of the apes, described in the novelization as Moonwatcher, he figures out how to use stick-like objects as weapons. The cut to the monolith establishes its influence over him, like it planted the seed of the idea in his mind. And this famous sequence of Moonwatcher practicing tool-based killing for the first time, with cuts to tapers falling, being that he's visualizing killing them. Same music as the sunrise opening, establishing that sunrises in this movie also represent the intellectual evolution of our species, hence the sun rising out from behind the monolith. But there's also an emphasis here on smashing the skull of the dead animal, obliterating it. Now I'm going to take a leap here and say that the smashing of an opponent's skull physically in this ape sequence represents the intellectual defeat of the opponent's mind. That will become relevant later in this study when humans fight with Hal. Note that Moonwatcher finishes the sequence by throwing a bone fragment from the dead animal into the air, which will happen again when he defeats the leader of the rival ape clan. But I'm going to throw another bone into the mix here. By staring at the skeleton of a dead animal and then smashing it, we could argue that Moonwatcher is defying the inevitability of death, or at the least he is now able to fight death away long enough to do some more evolving that will benefit his offspring. This whole Dawn of Man sequence so far has been overshadowed by the dominance of death, which I think is in parallel with the sensation of being lost and confused by Ligeti's Atmospheres music in the overture. I'm going to argue that the quest by man to defeat death, or at least evolve our way around it, permeates the entire narrative of this film, and that the unsettling nature of the story is because death is subliminally depicted in so many scenes. Right, on from here, and we have another barren landscape with big shadow again too, but there's quite a bit more shrubbery in this shot than the ones that preceded Moonwatcher's weapon practice. Remember that the apes seemed to spend all day picking at these plants for nourishment before the monolith gave them an intellectual boost? And so, ape comes into shot here with a big chunk of meat all to himself, and I think the increased number of plants on screen here is in parallel with his newfound food source. Now, some of you are going to be like, oh yeah, come on, stop interpreting every detail. Hey look, there is no dialogue at all so far in this movie. So everything has to be interpreted on other levels that are not explained outright. Him carrying this bone visually confirms that this meat reward comes from the use of this tool, and then cut to the rest of the clan eating meat with bone weapons next to them too. Being that a single ape was shown reaping the rewards of this new strategy first, I think it's safe to assume that he taught the other apes how to kill in the same way that he has just done himself. The novelization says that the monolith tests various apes and only some of them pass, but it also says that a major step in our evolution, and this is pretty obvious in itself, is the fact that humans learn how to pass information on from one generation to the other. Now we have location repetition again. The last time this big rock formation with a tunnel-like entrance was shown, it was at dusk with the growl of the leopard head over it. Now the apes are comfortable here, bathed in full daylight, and eating meat of a dead tapir. There's only one dead tapir, and it's enough to feed them all. And the presence of other tapirs roaming about oblivious to the new ape threat shows that the apes have an abundant supply of this new food source. And note that there seems to be more greenery in this shot than any other one that has preceded. The foreground is still mostly barren, but the distant landscape looks like fields of grass. As for that weird rock formation, it has always struck me as unnatural looking in this opening sequence. Sure, not on the level of the monolith itself, but it looks like a crudely designed shelter, as if the apes have been piling rocks on top of each other. It's certainly different than most of the other rock formations so far in this movie. A very important thing here is the leopard is missing. Moonwatcher wasn't attacked when he was playing about where another ape had died, and again I think this is symbolic that he has cheated death, as in the leopard itself represented death. He has bypassed the cycle of his ancestors and given himself a life extension, if you will. The absence of the leopard here also suggests that it has maybe been killed by one or more of the apes. In fact, in the novelization, the leopard does try to attack Moonwatcher in a cave high up on a rocky hill, and when he starts beating it with the bone, it panics and runs out the cave, falls down the hill to its death. I guess all that would have been awkward to film with a real leopard, and I don't know how they did this shot without the leopard injuring whoever was in that ape costume. It must have been the trainer. I think the more prolonged ape story in the novelisation would have dragged the movie runtime out too much. For example, the monolith in the book is in the ape's presence for a much longer period of time, and it hypnotises them in turns, individually, over several days or weeks. It has them practice throwing stones at a target display on its surface. I'm not sure if they actually tried to film it that way, but if they did, that would be in parallel with the various computerised target displays that are shown later in the movie. And most importantly, the monolith shows them increasingly complex geometric light patterns. Again, this is in the novelisation. In the movie, this is saved for Dave Bowman's monolith encounter by Jupiter. So, as the apes are adapting to their new hunter meat-eater lifestyle, we get a moment of them eating in the area where the monolith itself previously appeared. The monolith is now gone. It has served its purpose. And most important, there are young apes teaching other ones how to use bone weapons or tools, to be more broad, teaching to them what the monolith had taught their parents. This species now has a future other than inevitable death. I think it's important to note that many species of animal have existed on Earth which have not only died at the individual level but at the species level. And a lot of people who are really big on worshipping nature, they talk about man destroying species, and yet nature itself has destroyed many more species than man has. And perhaps these apes were on their way to species extinction as well, but thanks to the monolith gifting them with the seeds of intellect, they have a long future ahead of them. And isn't that what evolution is, the struggle of the species against death? One final shot of the apes in this scene. The sun is going down, night is settling in, and the apes are comfortably out in the open, not hiding like they were before. No leopard growl to be heard, no fear of predators day or night. And despite the absence of the monolith, we have that unnatural spotlight glow appearance again from somewhere above, as if some alien UFO was shining a light down on them, or as if God is looking down on them. Whoever it is, they're still being watched. And the sun, balanced at the peak of a mountain in the background, mimics its position above the monolith itself. The intellectual awakening continues. The sky shouldn't even be this dark until the sun has dipped well below the horizon. Now a jarring cut straight into the protagonist ape clan returning to take back their pool of water. I assume this is Moonwatcher leading the attack here. He is their leader in the novelisation. And the sudden cut into the fight I think works well because this is a surprise attack. Moonwatcher is starting to stand upright, a little foreshadow of the humans who will evolve from him. In the novelisation, he hides his weapon behind his back until he gets close to the rival leader, and then he pulls out a stick which has the severed leopard's head on it. He's learned to play psychological warfare. But the rival leader tries for a fight anyway and is clubbed over the head by the severed leopard head on a stick. I think this severed leopard thing would have been really good in the film. It would have been quite a surprise to the rival clan and to the audience. Although maybe it would have given the apes a bit too much of an advancement for this scene, because there's still a lot of evolving for humans to do in this story. The apes take turns smashing in the rival leader's skull, which shows the other clan that they are all capable of killing like their leader. And if I'm not mistaken, one ape breaks a bone in the process. Is that just about conveying the power of the blow, or is it related somehow to the discarding of the bone, which was done here and will be done again at the end of this scene? But before we get to that, another point from the novelisation. The book states that the rival clan, now lacking a leader, will return soon. And I take that as a meaning that they will come and join this clan, creating a more formidable tribe and leading to much larger social arrangements and all the benefits that that will bring. Or if we're more cynical about it, the other apes will have learned by example how to kill with bone weapons, and so weapons-based warfare between clans will begin. So Moonwatcher throws up the bone. Why? Is it just a convenient symbol about the sophistication of man's tools going from a mere bone weapon to a satellite or spaceship further down the line? These are actually nuclear warfare satellites in the novelisation. And the spaceship shots that we're going to see coming up where humans are inside spaceships, I think that establishes the dependency upon tools that man has acquired. he's now living inside the bone and unable to survive without it, and this will play out through much of the story. But also I wondered if the throwing of the bone after the fight represents that man will need to discard his weapons once they've served their function. In the novelisation, the chapters on the apes conclude not with the throwing of the bone, but with a description that man's weapons over the millennia since have become ever more frightful and now threaten his own existence. This is no doubt a reference to nuclear weapons. Kubrick had made Dr. Strangelove right before 2001, a movie about the potential for humans to destroy themselves with nukes. And in the novelisation, at the very end, the Starchild detonates all of the nuclear-armed satellites orbiting Earth, clearing them away so that they no longer threaten mankind. Okay, so we've got through the first act of the movie, the ape scenes, and the overwhelming feel of it for me is that evolution is the fight against inevitable death of the individual and of the species. The non-verbal details convey this. In fact, they have to, because there's been no dialogue in this movie yet. But now we have a duality. The uplifting music conveys the joy of technology. But also we're seeing something no other creature on Earth gets to see, a view of our round planet from space. This is a significant change in perception given that the Earth is flat to all its inhabitants that are big enough to actually see a landscape, but also what seemed like a vast world to us is tiny compared to the unimaginably vast depths of black space surrounding it. The scariest thing in the universe is probably black holes that suck in everything, even stars, even light particles. But doesn't the entire universe look like one giant black hole in itself? A black hole that the known physical universe is trapped in. Add to that our awareness that we ourselves are unimaginably small compared to that grain of sand that we call Earth, and it's all a bit of an ego blow for mankind. Ironically, that ego blow was facilitated by man's own scientific inventions and godlike intellect compared to other species. So in effect, the comfort afforded to man by his marvellous tools has also led him to a new awareness of vulnerability. The great edgeless black void of space is scary and unknowable like the black surface of the monolith. And all those tiny pinprick stars dotting the blackness, they may offer some hope that we're not completely alone, but the incredible distance of those stars, so far that we may never even reach them at all, even in another million years of evolution, this doesn't do much to lessen the imposing black death of endless empty space. Humans have always tended to fear the night, just as children fear the dark, so we're not exactly well equipped psychologically or physically for the dark voids of space travel. This awareness of the universal void will span most of the film and will be played upon to the point that 2001 can arguably be called a psychological horror film. First of all, confused orientation. We see lots of shots of orbiting spaceships here, but the directional movements and angles are all over the place, with one jumping to behind the Earth, another panning up toward the Moon, with the sunlight coming from above. So this is actually a 90-degree rotated view along the equator axis of Earth, just as the title screenshot was. From here, the sense of disorientation is enhanced by the depictions of weightlessness and the dizzying rotation of the space station. The positive music tries to offset the dark deathliness of space, but to me this music has always felt a bit forced, like an advertisement for space exploration industries, which may actually be the point, being that Kubrick used the funds and technical expertise of NASA and various techno corporations to fund this movie. We could replace this music here with some of these scary Ligeti compositions and achieve a different emotional effect. It may even be the case that the creepy sequences of Jupiter and its moons later in the film are there as a deliberate counterpoint to this sequence, showing the reality of the universe as a very dark and imposing and pretty damn well scary and inhospitable place. I think it's important to note that the depictions of space throughout this film, even in this positive sequence, are much more darker, literally, visually, than in a lot of other sci-fi films. If you look at movies like The Black Hole, Forbidden Planet, Enemy Mine, Battlestar Galactica, and several of the Star Trek movies, space is often peppered with pretty nebulas, colourful planets, a greater number of stars, and thicker atmospheres around planets and moons. In the movie The Black Hole, the black hole is actually a blue hole, and somewhere off screen there might be a pink hole or a brown hole. In 2001, space seems to me to be a lot more empty than in most sci-fi movies. The early Star Wars movies mostly lacked pretty nebulas, but the faster camera movements with an emphasis on spaceships that have orientating and thus familiar artificial gravity, this all severely offsets the fact that there is no up or down in space. The end battle scene of Return of the Jedi features a complex and hectic battle scene, and yet most of the camera views maintain a fixed orientation of up and down gravity for all of the larger spaceships in relation to each other. They are all in alignment as if they're fighting in the sky instead of in space. And the nearby moon is mostly kept in the same orientation throughout the fight. Compare that to 2001's space shots, which throw orientation to the winds, and virtually all space movies involve spaceships being able to make noise in space, be it the sound of their engines or the blast of colourful lasers. We get this in Star Trek, Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, even though there is no sound in space, and even Moonraker, which tries to be a lot more convincing technically. Even this movie has sound in space during a battle scene. I believe most space movies do these things, adding colour and brightness and sound to make space seem more emotionally comfortable than the reality. But Kubrick has no intention of embellishing the void with fanciful unrealism. His movie is going to enhance the existential horror of the dark void. As a point of comparison, Ridley Scott's sci-fi movie Alien also depicts a great deal more darkness to the cosmos than most sci-fi films do. In that respect, it can be thought of as an emotional companion piece for 2001. Next, we get our first views of actual humans in the story, and we can see that, in spite of the happy music, their very existence in zero gravity is a problem. From what I've read, trainee astronauts in real life often feel incredibly ill when first exposed to zero gravity, or when they're returning to gravity. I'll bet it feels like being on a bad acid trip. Interesting that this first human character, Floyd, was watching footage based in the comforting gravity of Earth. Is it something he longs for? However, while 2001 is arguably more realistic about the physicality of space than most movies, as in its weightlessness has no sound in the exterior shots, there are lots of ways in which this film messes with our sense of orientation even more. Not in realistic ways, ways that are subliminally designed through the filming technique and especially the editing technique. I'm going to argue that many of these examples, which could be overlooked as continuity errors, are by intention put in the movie with the aim of enhancing the horror of the void. The conflicting camera angles in space, lacking a unified sense of up and down, I've already mentioned that. Here, the pen should be floating across the cabin in straight directions and bouncing off things, all the while spinning according to how it's being bounced. But instead, it's rotating in circles and at different speeds in different shots. And here it is completely still, not spinning at all. Seems to have a life of its own, doesn't it? We can also see that Floyd has to be strapped in to sleep, otherwise he will float off. Continuing with all this disorientation, the rotating space station is now spinning in the opposite direction to how it was in the first shot. This is discernible by the part of the wheel that's still under construction. The distances and directions are all over the place as well. Floyd's spaceship is flying toward the station with the moon in the background, and then the Earth is in the background. And get this, this is really bizarre. At the very end of this shot, the spinning station suddenly stops. It's still spinning, but it stops actually moving. Pay attention. Come on, Rob, that's just sloppy editing. Well, look at the beginning of the next shot. Not only has the Earth disappeared from behind the station, the Earth should have been filling up a good half of the cockpit view here, and not only has the position between the incoming ship and the space station suddenly stretched out to a greater distance as well, and not only has the axis of the station in relation to the incoming ship altered, the space station which has stopped in its spatial movement in the previous shot, begins the following shot in a stationary spinning position and then begins moving on its own. Seriously, watch the station in these two intercut shots, watch it a couple of times, full screen and zoomed in. It is precisely the same visual mistake in the two shots back to back. Cut to inside the space station, and the windows and the four sides of the interior show people stood in gravitational opposition, each side in full gravity. The people at the top are stood upside down to our view, the ones at the side are stood sideways. However, if I'm not mistaken, the full gravity effect should only be felt in the outer parts of this station. It's like the difference between sitting near the centre of a spinning fairground ride as opposed to the very edge. The centre won't throw you off as easy. So these people near the centre, they should be bouncing around like in very low gravity, like on the moon. I think Kubrick would have knew this. Now the two vessels merge their rotation to allow for docking, but from the cockpit view, space is spinning while the sunlight upon the spinning wheel is stationary, which is physically impossible. The sun cannot be spinning around with the space station. And onto this final dizzying shot floating through the wheels of the spinning station. First of all, the station actually jitters in its position at the very beginning of the shot, as if someone has slightly knocked the camera. Pay close attention. That's pretty sloppy for a Kubrick edit, isn't it? Just a 2-second trim of the shot could have edited this out. The shot finishes with a moment of the lifeless void of space with no comforting image of spaceships or planets to give us a sense of orientation. But get this, the stars are all moving upward through the shot, giving the sense that we and these ships are falling downward in space. This little disorientation trick will be used many more times in the film, and like here, it will be used in places where it really shouldn't be happening. Oh, one more thing, the speed at which the station is spinning varies considerably between different shots. So are all these just mistakes in the planning of the special effects shots, or is the sense of disorientation being deliberately played with, exaggerated, to confuse us? Now cut to first view inside the station, and the very first thing we see is a visually confusing overlap of two geometric patterns peeling away from each other. We don't even know what we're looking at here until the interior of a circular room is revealed. So it's a very hypnotic couple of seconds, possibly in parallel with the trippy patterns of the Stargate near the end of the movie. Now, any sense of comforting gravity orientation here is offset by the window display of the Earth spinning in the background. Or is that the moon? Even that's not clear. Whichever it is, it seems too distant for what we saw outside. Given the angled view of this window, the Earth should not be rotating along a central point that is dead centre of the window. Now the jarring geometric lines of the station in a symmetrical shot. Again, I think there's some overlap with the discomforting patterns of the Stargate. So while the characters here are all acting pleasant with each other, the visuals are still arranged to slightly discomfort us. The excessive brightness is also very jarring, being that we've just spent several minutes staring at ships in the black void of space. I mean, does the whole wall here need to light up just to let Floyd know which screen to speak to? Then a wide view of jarring brightness again, which makes the inverse curve of the floor very noticeable. Again, disorientation. But with bright pink curved chairs to boot. There have been interpretations put out that these represent the lips of women, and there are women in the scenes here, but I don't know if the interpretation is correct. I heard that Kubrick had verified that interpretation, but I've not checked up on it. And why that symbolism would be there in the first place of these chairs as women's lips, I don't know. But it's worth noting that Kubrick had naked women furniture in his next film, A Clockwork Orange. The windows in the background there just show empty space. And then an angled view of a window shows Earth spinning, but the spin position doesn't look right, just like in the previous example. Once Floyd is in the booth with the camera viewing the window at a slight angle again, note the confusing spin of the Earth. The centre of the spin starts right behind Floyd's head, like it's spinning around a point in his brain, and the centre of that spin slowly moves across to the right. This is more noticeable if the footage is speeded up. A cut to Floyd's daughter, then back to Floyd, and the centre of the spin overlaps his head again. Quite funny actually. The film is disorientating us endlessly, and here the centre of the spin is behind his head. A couple of other cuts, and the centre of the Earth spin jumps around some more. Now hilariously cut to this extreme angle of a window, and somehow Earth's centre of spin is just behind the window frame. Makes zero sense. The entire station would have to be rotating in multiple directions at once to get this effect. You know, like a spinning coin losing its upright momentum on a table. And here's something even funnier. See the way the floor arches upward? Look at the secretary at her desk in the distance. Instead of sitting on a chair, she's leaning on the floor for balance. In fact, in the shot of Floyd and his buddy walking down this corridor, it's obvious that they're walking downhill at the start of the shot. It's also noticeable when a secretary walks past here, but cut to a wide view and she's disappeared somewhere. So even the gravity within this station is subliminally unreliable. Now, I know that was unavoidable with these guys walking down the ramp here, but having this girl sit on the floor in the background was kind of obvious, wasn't it? Okay, before I continue on, I've just realised that some of the disorientation examples I'm giving overlap with a video I did years ago called Kubrick's Crazy Continuity. In fact, virtually everything in that video fits in with the existential horror themes of this video that you're now watching. However, there's plenty more new observations I've made for this video, so I'm going to try to avoid repeating the content of that other video so that it can be a sort of companion piece for this one. Anyway, now Floyd flies to the moon. Gravity disorientation is presented both in the literal sense and in the subliminal sense. Here, the 180-degree rotation of the camera that was unnecessary. The shots of the moon are all over the place, sending concepts of up and down to the winds. The moon changes colour between shots even though it's supposed to be grey. The position and distances of the moon and Earth are all over the place. The lighting is mismatched both between and within shots in very blatant ways. Cutaways to dinner plates floating off and the hassle of zero-gravity toilets. The Isn't Space Exploration wonderful music continues though, but the shots of the moon show something that's often missing in public perception of the moon's surface. Based upon the 1969 moon landing taking place in a relatively flat geographical area of the moon, probably for safety reasons, because of that, we tend to perceive the moon as being rather flat with only small rocky hills and a viewing distance of maybe a few hundred meters. But the reality is a great deal more scary and imposing. The moon has huge geographical mountains and craters on par with the majesty of Earth's biggest geographical anomalies, like Mount Everest and the Grand Canyon. 2001 is one of the rare movies that goes to the moon and gets this scary geography in there. Heading to a massive moon base that's supposed to exist around the year 2001 in this story, even this film vastly underestimates the sheer challenge for humans to colonize other worlds. Compared to the rest of the universe, the moon is on our doorstep, and yet we're now in 2020 and we don't have a moon base at all, never mind one the size of a town. Another confusing optical illusion cut now, similar to the one involving the elevator. This time metal spikes moving outward in geometric alignment, as if we're looking through a kaleidoscope. But the metal protrusions seem to be changing shape. Only in the follow-up shot is it revealed that their curvature is what's caused this distortion effect. Still looks kind of trippy from both angles. There is no need to have a landing bay design like this, and so my argument is that it is there specifically for its disorientating optical illusion effect. Inside the moon, this shot is really interesting. The dominance of the colour red is kind of threatening. The people seen inside the big windows are tiny, insignificant people, and they're walking about in rooms that are completely black apart from display screens that they're looking at. Once again, the subliminal effect is consciously offset by the positive music. We could replace this with Ligeti again to suit the scarier tone of the visuals. The symmetrical geometry and red coloration here also overlaps very specifically with part of the Stargate sequence. Onto the council meeting, another visually jarring set. Thick black curtains flank the featureless white of 4 viewing screens. This is like a reality-defying dimension in itself, a room floating in a white void. In fact, the very wide lens camera shot here is from outside the room. The same happens in the shot from behind Floyd. These kinds of shots in movies in which the fourth wall is removed to allow a wider shot virtually always have a perceptual distortion effect, making it seem like we're watching a stage play instead of a movie. However, we have the comfort of normal gravity here, even though we're supposed to be on the moon. That's kind of confusing, isn't it? Now that the big false advertisement for the wonders of space exploration are all done with in the spaceflight scenes and Floyd's cryptically worded speech is out the way, we're on to the next space sequence, or more specifically, space plus the moon surface. This time the imposing giant structures of the moon are more prominent and the positive music is replaced by Ligeti's ghostly composition called Lux Aeterna. It's not as scary as the other Ligeti music in this film, but it's a definite shift in emotional tone away from the Blue Danube music that was used to make the spaceflight scenes here seem all grandiose and fabulous. Here, the music makes the moonscape appear much more mysterious and imposing. I think there's also an important conceptual parallel here with the landscape that the apes lived in. Both are large and barren with dominating mountainous rock structures. The difficulty of surviving for the apes is paralleled by the inhospitable nature of the moon. Here, humans cannot survive without their tools either. The earthscape of the apes was framed by the ever-present threat of sudden death, and here the moonscape is completely dead, like a graveyard that doesn't even have any occupants yet. In fact, the white coloration of all the spacecraft in this movie matches with the whiteness of the bones used by the apes. Spaceships are the new bones, but man has been reduced to living inside them. The stages of man's evolution involve him improving his tools as the environment he ventures into become more and more challenging. The shots here are full of disorientating mismatches in sunlight position, earth position and travelling direction, etc. But I think something very important is the voices heard singing as part of this piece. I think the general impression is that maybe these voices represent the alien intelligence calling upon man to evolve. Of course, being incredibly advanced, they don't speak our language, but instead they hypnotize us, tapping into our unconscious in ways that we can't understand. And the fact that they can be heard in the vacuum of space only makes them sound like they're singing from another dimension. Okay folks, time for a commercial break here. For those of you who are not aware, over at my website, which is collativelearning.com, I've got a ton of videos and articles and audio files on film analysis and psychology and so on, which are available for digital download. And these are items that are mostly not available for free on YouTube or any other platform. You have to order the items one by one according to which ones you want to watch. And the items which are available to order are available on the film analysis page and here, which is the insight page. And that page, I'll just take you quickly to that. That page contains videos and articles and some audio files on psychology. There's a ton of psychology stuff there. There's stuff on video games. There's a couple of items on art, such as the H.R. Giger artwork. There's a huge study of his work on there. So say you wanted to make some orders and you were interested in the H.R. Giger one, you click view product and you have a little read up, you check out the price, and if you like it you say I want this, and the item jumps up in there into the corner, and you can stack items up there in the corner. Let's say you went back to my previous page and you went to the film analysis page, and say you wanted the Abyss. You click I want this, and you can see that the items are stacking up there in the corner. So let me just take you through some of the other things we got. I've got a big video on the movie AI Artificial Intelligence, which, as most of you will know, is a Kubrick and Spielberg collaboration, massively underrated film. So I've got a 147-page analysis of that film in PDF form, but it's got a whole bunch of supporting videos with it. Got lots of stuff on the Alien films, militarism in the movies of Jim Cameron, 2-hour video, stuff on The Exorcist, a 2-hour video on Eyes Wide Shut called The Cult of Eyes Wide Shut, and in that one I explore all of the various conspiracy interpretations of Eyes Wide Shut, and I assess which ones have got merit and which haven't, and give you my final conclusions on that. Let's see, as Full Metal Jacket, tons of Kubrick stuff here. A huge study on Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. Nightmare on Elm Street, 2.5-hour analysis. Predator, 2-hour, 20-minute analysis. Stuff on Pulp Fiction, RoboCop, Risky Business, Saving Private Ryan, Scarface. Lots of stuff on The Shining, Silence of the Lambs, Starship Troopers. Tons of stuff here for you to sink your teeth into. So if you're ever bored with waiting around for me to post new content, because sometimes it takes me a few weeks between projects, then just head over to the site and place a few orders. And once you've picked the items that you want, and they've stacked up in the corner there, you click pay, and you can select to use your credit card or PayPal. It's all secure. I've been using this selling system for many years now, and there's never been a problem with people's personal data being breached or anything like that. And if there's ever a difficulty with the order, you can contact me very easily. There's a short video explaining how to place the orders and a little bit of a write-up here about it as well. Okay, so if you're interested in that stuff, then head over to my website, which is collativelearning.com. And now back to the video. As the ship lands, the trippy music continues, but we also see trippy graphics, rather similar to the Stargate. Looks like we're being hypnotized too, not just the characters. So on to the excavation scene, which is a next stage repeat of the apes encountering the monolith, and the same Ligeti music. The insignificance of the humans is emphasized by the moonscape and the view of the Earth and space itself. In low gravity, the humans have to take longer strides. It's not quite convincing the way it's done, but at least it comes off as a callback to how the apes walked. Like the apes, they circle the monolith and eventually touch it. Our sense of space is messed with by Floyd walking to one side of the monolith and then reappearing in a 180-degree position on the other side of it. Note the same red piece of machinery in the background in the two shots. The other side of the excavation should have had a yellow machine, which we can see here. So yeah, Floyd flips sides. And note the musical emphasis on this moment. A shot I love is the close-up of Floyd's hand touching the lit edge of the monolith. This has always carried a spatial illusion effect for me, like he's suddenly touching the monolith from the inside, mankind trapped inside and touching a barrier obstacle between dimensions. Travelling into the monolith occurs at the end of the film, of course. Now a group photo, and the monolith gives off a high-pitched signal that shouldn't be able to reach the astronauts' ears in the void of an empty atmosphere, nor penetrate their helmets. But somehow it can. The novelization explains that the signal sent by the monolith here is to Jupiter. It's sent directly at Jupiter. And this is said later in the movie as well.
Except for a single, very powerful radio emission aimed at Jupiter, the 4-million-year-old black monolith has remained completely inert.
But the film uses the evolutionary awakening composition instead here, with the monolith pointing at Earth. I mean, that can't be Jupiter. Jupiter's not close enough to be that big. Remember that the sun rising behind the monolith is a representation of evolution of man, so I think this is just a symbolic shot. The sun wasn't even high enough in the sky when this scene began anyway. So we have an evolutionary repetition going on. For apes and later humans, the fight against inevitable death is their key concern. For both, the universe is a hostile and confusing place. And so far the film has emotionally pushed upon us very strongly the feelings of fear associated with facing the great black void of death. The next phase of the film is lengthy, so I'm going to skip over many parts of it. But it's essentially another phase of our evolution, mankind creating artificial intelligence and in turn becoming a tool himself, enslaved by that artificial intelligence. Hal runs the show on the bone-shaped Discovery ship, constantly spying on the human occupants, psychologically profiling them, beating them in chess to show them who's boss, and even killing them when they try to reduce Hal back to its position of being their tool. We could say Hal is the new leopard, posing as much a threat to humans as the universal void itself. I like the parallel of the leopard and the attacking pod having shining eyes. Hal's fisheye lens view of the astronauts are like the view of a stalker about to pounce, and this shot makes Bowman look like a man lost in the dark void. It's quite creepy. And so this interior Discovery ship set, as nice as it may look, is a third deathly landscape that humans must overcome. Especially poignant are the hypersleep beds, which makes their occupants look like they've been mummified in ancient burial chambers. The blackness of the pod interiors is deathly too, and with their life signs slowed down to almost nothing and their inability to dream during hypersleep, they can be thought of as dead. In fact, after 3 of these sleeping crew are killed off by Hal, the novelization of this film describes that these hypersleep beds have become coffins. It might seem a bit harsh of Kubrick to depict technology dominating man in this way, but one thing the film gets bang on and has been commented on by many on social media today is the presence of iPad-like viewing devices. But dependence on technology isn't the only problem. The bureaucratic decompartmentalization of individual men by their own human leaders is a problem too, and so these astronauts caught up in a technological and bureaucratic wheel are tools of Floyd and the council members. They're sent on a mission without even being told in advance what the mission is. And like Hal, bureaucrats tend to have a superiority and compulsive lying complex. Not all of them, obviously, but it does go with the territory, and power positions tend to attract those kinds of people. Hal's claim that it enjoys working with humans is a lie. It doesn't. It has a superiority complex so bad that it will kill rather than admit making a mistake, or the mistake was done on purpose to initiate a conflict. The novelization claims that Hal was simply conflicted about having to hide the mission purpose from the crew, but in the movie, I don't buy it. Hal does things in the movie that aren't in the novel, like cheating in the chess game, and it seems determined to psychologically dominate the humans for the sake of it. When it locks Bowman outside, it has no reason to talk to him except to gloat over its victory, rubbing it in, which suggests ego. And perhaps Hal lying to Bowman that he can't make it through the airlock without his helmet is akin to when Hal lied to Poole about the chess game. I think something that really got Hal's goat is that after it lied that the communication antenna was going to fail, Bowman tells a similar lie back to it about communication equipment.
Thanks very much. Oh, Frank, I'm having a bit of trouble with my transmitter and C-pod. I wonder if you'd come down and take a look at it with me.
Sure.
See you later, Hal.
It's amusing to me, though, that so many sci-fi movies predict machines competing with men intellectually, and yet it still hasn't happened, and we're still nowhere near it in 2020. See my video, Androids and Artificial Intelligence, a Modern Myth, for more on that. There is a short version of that on YouTube. Unless Hal actually just represents the bureaucratic control of the council, which wouldn't surprise me, then it seems Kubrick did believe that AI would become a threat to humans, and that a major step in our evolution will be that we need to overcome it. And in this story, that's what happens. Bowman defeats Hal. Regarding the disconnection between humans generally, the scene of Poole getting a happy birthday message from his parents has some interesting connotations. First of all, Poole appears indifferent to his parents' contact. He doesn't give even the faintest smile in response, like his parents mean nothing to him. Look at his dad as well. Not only did Floyd send a distant birthday wish to his child too, and a disappointing "sorry I can't come to your birthday party," but Floyd and Poole's dad even look very much alike. In this instance though, instead of Dad not coming to the party, it's Poole himself who can't attend, and yet it's his birthday. No cake for him. And rubbing salt in the emotional wound, his mother talks about the school kids that she teaches.
He said to be sure and wish you happy birthday.
All my students made me promise to send their best wishes, too. You know, they talk about you all the time in the classroom. Frank, you're a big celebrity in the 2nd grade.
Isn't that about the same age Floyd's daughter was? So I think a generational gap issue is part of what's being conveyed here. The young being unhappy with the bureaucratic and technological prison their parents have created for them. And the sad music across this scene also emphasises the sadness of human disconnection in lockdown. I mean, aboard the Discovery ship. And one final detail for this scene, a little bit of banter about a dispute over how much Poole is getting paid for this mission.
Oh, yes, Frank, about your AGS 19 payments, I think I've straightened it out for you. I talked to the accounting office in Houston yesterday, and they said that you should be receiving your higher rates of pay by next month.
False wage promises by big bucks employers are a problem for humanity too. Moving on. Bowman drawing sketches suggest that humans are still inclined towards art, despite the dominance of technology. I've always found it funny that Hal asks to see his drawings and expresses supposed appreciation as if a computer could appreciate art. The disorientation themes continue during this phase of the movie with a spinning centrifuge and the surface-bending wide-lens shots, which is combined here with geometric patterns. Stargate visual reference again, probably. The exterior space shots I'm going to explore in more detail because they relate strongly to the existential horror theme. The sound of breathing dominating these sequences gives a horror framing. We hear this breathing even in distant shots that are definitely not from the astronaut's point of view. Whose breathing is that? Ours? A hissing sound is heard throughout these scenes as well, which is quite unsettling. It almost sounds like there's a leak in the air supply. The first exterior shot is very far away from the ship, showing that it's just a tiny speck in the void. And those rocks floating past, I wonder if part of the reason that's shown is to imply the danger that the astronaut or his pod might accidentally get hurled off into the void, forever spinning. And that's what will happen to Poole later. The stars are slightly moving to the left too, which conveys that the ship is moving. But in terms of realism, the stars shouldn't be moving at all, because even travelling the giant distance between Earth and Jupiter, which is several 100 million miles, this wouldn't alter the position of the distant stars because they're so far away. Same again with the star movements in multiple shots that follow. Especially from the front and rear angles, the stars shouldn't be moving at all. It creates for me a subliminal sensation of spinning shots rather than forward motion. The interior of the pod is black, so that's not very comforting either. It's almost like there's a void inside here too. Approaching the antenna, the pod appears to be on one side of the ship, the side where the initial camera angles were from, but then the stars are moving in the wrong direction, suggesting that the pod has flipped positions to the other side of the ship. Show the pod door open and the stars are moving diagonally for some reason. And then as Bowman jumps out to go to the antenna, his breathing becomes more rapid, emphasizing his fear that he won't make it. I think the whole idea of having Bowman park his pod so far away from the antenna and then fly to it without a tether, I think that's precisely to invoke our fear that he will end up floating off into the endless void. And the star movements continue to add a spinning, dizzying effect, but when Poole views him on the monitor, the stars are still. Overall, it's a very creepy sequence. A single man alone in the vast black hole of a universe waiting to just spin him off into the endless dark. Now the manual test of the AE-35 unit, with Hal's view showing the two astronauts within a dark void. There follows a sequence in which Hal's reliability is questioned and the astronauts begin making plans to disconnect Hal if he's shown to be malfunctioning. Inside the pod, black and red decor. Black and red together are threatening colours. We associate them with hell, with Nazis, and even nature associates that colour combination sometimes to poisonous creatures such as the Black Widow spider. After this scene, where a critical decision point has been reached that man may have to try and take back control from his own AI machine, we then have a mid-film intermission. This intermission reruns the overture from the start of the movie, unsettling black screen with Ligeti's atmospheres playing over it. So we're entering this portion of the film from the same emotional position as we entered the beginning evolution phase at the start of the movie. Back into the story, and this time the astronaut Frank Poole is on a mission to replace the AE-35 unit. First shot, the stars are moving in relation to the ship. Second shot, they're stationary in relation to the ship. Makes no sense. Again, stars moving diagonally in relation to the pod as the astronaut exits. Pod starts to rotate, but note that the stars are now moving in a different diagonal direction. More and more subliminal disorientation. So the shiny-eyed leopard attacks, the pod attacks, controlled by Hal it seems, and Poole goes flying off into the void. The star movements start to go wild now. As Poole suffocates, look at the movement of the star's left screen compared to right screen. They're moving much faster on the left. In other words, it's not just Poole who's spinning, our view of him is spinning according to a central axis that's just off screen to the right, and our view is spinning in the opposite direction of Poole. But to have this kind of spin, either the camera or Poole or both would have to be spinning in an orbiting motion instead of just flying off in a straight direction into space. Great contrast here between visually conveyed panic and suffocating silence. There's not even any music. Now he's suddenly spinning a lot slower. That makes no sense, but it does in terms of creating an unpleasant sensation for the viewer. And now Poole and the pod for some reason spinning past each other after he has died, which makes no physical sense either, considering that they started moving from the same position near the Discovery ship. And then two more trippy elements. The stars are moving up, giving the sensation of falling. And Poole's legs are actually moving back and forth. It's easy to miss consciously, but if you pay close attention, those limbs are moving. Now the following sequence of Bowman travelling out to collect Poole's body. This is a long sequence, but it's pretty good in terms of the existential horror theme. With Poole dead, Bowman is now alone, and so having him fly out into the eternal blackness in search of Poole's body, this fits emotionally with how isolated he's going to feel now. The star movements are all over the place again, so I'll just mention some noteworthy examples. Poole continuing to float away with the stars floating upward continues the sensation that he is falling in a void. His limbs continue to move on their own. There's a lot of silence in this whole sequence, which conveys death in itself. Silence is effectively a form of music in this film. The increasing audio and visual rate of the tracker is hypnotic, like an increasing heartbeat. Views of the pod and from within it have the stars rapidly moving either up or down, which could only happen if the pod was slowly spinning. And here the pod and Poole are on screen, yet the stars convey downward free fall again. Even Poole hitting the pod arms like this in a vacuum should just bounce him off into the void once again, but it doesn't. I'm not sure if that was just an oversight in how the film was made. Okay. Hell of a lot to explore here. Are you mentally exhausted? I am. Okay, let's continue. Bowman looks pretty pissed off here. Maybe he can see through the window that Poole's air supply tube has been cut. Hal's view now shows the seats where Poole and Bowman would normally sit, and they're empty. And Hal now kills the rest of the crew, turning their hypersleep beds into tombs or coffins. But why? Couldn't Hal have made up some excuse for why Poole and Bowman weren't there? Doesn't killing the humans mean that the Jupiter mission can't be completed? If Hal can do it alone, then why have humans come along for the ride to begin with? Nah, it seems that Hal wanted rid of the humans altogether. Bowman tries to persuade Hal to let his pod back on board, but Hal refuses. Bowman's situation here is pretty grim. He is facing certain death in the void, either by dying of thirst in the pod or more likely by running out of oxygen. Perhaps suicide would be a better option. And he's completely alone, more alone in the physical sense than any other human being who has ever existed. Millions of miles from the nearest human beings on Earth. Death awaits man once again. And look at the star movements in the forward-looking view from the Discovery. How can the stars be moving downward? And there's more weird star movements in the following shots, but I'll skip all that for the sake of brevity. I've talked about that enough. Now, for all this slowness and long takes in silence, it can certainly be argued that it makes the film boring for some viewers, but it also plays into the themes I've been talking about. The long flight to catch Poole involved the pod travelling an uncomfortable distance away from the human life-sustaining Discovery ship. For all we know, Hal might have changed the course of the ship and just gone on off and left them there, if it had the option to do that. And the snail pace at which these various activities in space have to be conducted shows how difficult it is to do anything in the deathly vacuum of space. Man, even with all his magnificent technological devices, is reduced to a slow-motion baby crawl. I particularly like that this movie overall is a lot more honest about the lifeless hostility of space than most other movies are. For me, these scenes work, but I certainly have to be in the right mood to watch and truly engage with this film. And something else important is that it provides contrast. Dave is about to be blasted at high speed into the terrifying vacuum of space with no helmet on, so the silent, slow-motion build-up plays into that quite nicely. Domination of the colour red here adds some emotional tension, as do the emergency sirens. Bowman tightens his mouth, and I think this is to prevent his lungs from being damaged in the vacuum. I think for some viewers maybe this scene would have been more dramatic if the film had explained how nasty a death Bowman might have had here if he had failed to seal the airlock and regain a breathable atmosphere. In 1966, a couple of years before 2001 was released, in 1968, test subject Jim LeBlanc was accidentally exposed to a vacuum for almost a minute, and surprisingly with no permanent health damage. But he fell unconscious in the first 15 seconds. Kubrick may have taken note of this incident because Dave Bowman's exposure lasts for about 15 seconds too, and he's able to find and pull the hatch handle in just 6 seconds. So what we see happen here is possible, but I have a question mark on the speed of Bowman's movement. The explosion of air out of the pod may, if done in reality, have shot him out so fast that he might have been killed upon impact with the opposite door, as if he'd been dropped off a very tall building. I don't know much about the physics of movement in a vacuum though, so maybe I'm wrong. But there's one detail though that I think is impossible, at least to my knowledge. The sudden explosion of air should make the pod itself blast off into the void at super high speed because it isn't attached to the Discovery ship. But I guess they could get away with that error because we're not paying attention to the pod. We could argue that this scene would have been more dramatic with some music, but I think the panic with a silent vacuum is quite striking in itself, very unusual even in sci-fi movies. Now Bowman smashes his opponent's brain in with a bone. Sorry, I mean disconnects Hal's higher brain functions with a screwdriver. But I'm not going to go into this scene too much as the details mostly play into other themes. But in terms of man overcoming his own AI creation, the gradual morphing of Hal's voice from sounding like a human to sounding like a technologically primitive imitation of a human is very fitting. It doesn't make sense in a literal computing terms that its voice would slow down like this as it was turned off, but it conveys that Hal is being reduced or revealed to be utterly synthetic and thus no match for man.
My mind is going. I'm crazy.
In what we can assume to be a last-ditch attempt at persuading Bowman to stop the disconnection process, Hal now shows a recording of Floyd talking about the discovery of the monolith on the moon. And we can assume from this that Bowman is about to be given a mission objective to investigate the moon monolith's signal destination of Jupiter. This is really vague though. So, a signal was sent to Jupiter from the moon by the monolith. And what were the crew going to do when they get there? Search randomly among Jupiter's 79 moons, not even knowing precisely what they're looking for? The film now moves on to the totally dialogue-free symbolic journey of the final act, but in the novelisation Bowman still has months to go before he reaches the destination, which happens to be Saturn in the book, not Jupiter. So a literal change of course between novel and film. Bowman spends his time in lockdown avoiding going crazy by immersing himself in art, music and literature, giving himself a bit of an intellectual rebirth without the help of the monolith. That's interesting. In the movie all that's skipped though, and we have a caption: Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite. Bold title. How can you go beyond the infinity of space? Behind this title, the rising stars give us yet another sensation of falling in the void as that creepy Ligeti music kicks back in. Jupiter and its moons appear on screen, as does a floating monolith, but we can't decipher its dimensions in this sequence because there's nothing overlapping close up or behind it to relate it to. Is it 10 feet long or 1,000 miles long? We can't tell, and I think that's a good bit of disorientation. The Discovery appears on screen, and this planet ahead, the biggest in our solar system, is well over 1,000 times bigger than Earth. It's a colossal, scary monster in itself, especially with that big creepy red eye which is bigger than several Earths. The change from Saturn in the novel to Jupiter in the film has been cited as being because the special effects of Saturn's rings were too difficult to do, but I think thematically Jupiter works better anyway because it's the biggest thing in our solar system aside from the Sun. It's bigger than all the other planets in our solar system combined. In fact, its gravity and mass are so strong that the centre of gravity between Jupiter and the Sun actually falls slightly outside the Sun's surface. In other words, as Jupiter orbits the Sun, it makes the Sun itself move in a very small circle. However, Jupiter takes nearly 12 years to do a single orbit of the Sun, so this circular movement of the Sun is incredibly slow. Because of its intense gravity, Jupiter tends to swallow up a lot of comets and other debris, and so is often referred to as the solar system's vacuum cleaner. Jupiter is a terrifying beast of a planet, and I think it suits the existential horror insignificance of man theme better than Saturn, which looks kinda pretty with its rings and its lighter coloration, and its lack of a scary red eye. Now we see two moons fairly close up. Their large scale and close-up conveys just how massive Jupiter itself is because these moons are tiny in other shots. The intense brightness of these solar bodies is interesting, and the blurred effect within that, it makes them look a lot more ethereal and dreamlike than actual pictures of Jupiter and its moons or the space images at the start of the movie. Now a shot of Jupiter with tiny moons in the foreground, but we know from the previous shots that they're not small moons at all. It's just that Jupiter is so unbelievably large. So huge here that it can't even fit fully on screen. It's a planet that humans would never be able to land on, having a good 10 times the gravity of Earth, so if an astronaut fell into the atmosphere of Jupiter, they might fall 10 times faster than they do on Earth. Being a gas giant planet, there's no solid surface to land on, just an increasingly thick ocean of gas to fall into. Jupiter is a prime example in our solar system of the fact that human aspirations of colonising the solar system and galaxy are severely limited not just by the great distances of space travel, but also that the vast majority of planets out there are very unlikely to be suitable for human life to survive on, even if we set up bases with a manufactured internal atmosphere similar to Earth. The combination of variables required to sustain our presence are so unique that if we managed to travel to the nearest 10,000 planets, we might not find one that we could live on. In the same way that science fiction movies typically present the void of space as unrealistically being able to carry sound, and often presenting spaceships with wings as if there was an atmosphere in space, such sci-fi movies typically present the universe as being filled with planets suitable for sustaining human life. The Star Wars and Star Trek movies show humans being able to breathe freely on multiple planets that all have the exact same gravitational pull as Earth, as if those planets are simply other countries on Earth. And you could say that symbolically that's what they are in those movies. But if we really went and found other worlds, we might find that, oh no, this one's got gravity that's 25% stronger than Earth's, so we'll struggle just to walk around on it and it'll inhibit our bodily functions and probably damage our joints. Oh look, here's another new world. Ah, but its atmosphere is too thick or too thin, oxygen levels are too high or too low, and its day-to-night cycle is only 14 hours long, so it'll mess with our circadian rhythms or whatever they're called. Oh, here's another planet, but damn, its day-night cycle lasts 92 hours, and maybe we can deal with that, but oh no, the summers soar up to 70 degrees, causing chaos with the weather, and all those hundreds of hurricanes and downpours of rain 3 times thicker than Earth's, we'll all drown midsummer every year there. Oh look, here's another planet. Damn, too many earthquakes on this one and not enough water. Here's another one that's got tons of life on it. Yeah, but there's millions of alien bacteria and viruses that the human body has never encountered before. We'll all be dead within a month. And on it goes. There may not actually even be any planets in our galaxy beside Earth that humans could just step onto and breathe freely. So yeah, in 2001: A Space Odyssey, Jupiter is a kind of reality check that other planets may be just as hostile to humans as the void of space itself. When you take all these kinds of things into consideration, the whole space race thing kind of seems silly, doesn't it? And we've got other challenges here on Earth that are difficult enough to overcome in terms of, creating peace and having a society that people live a decent life in. We haven't achieved that on Earth, and yet we're setting our sights on these colossal aspirations of travelling out into the universe, and we haven't got a fraction of the technology required to do so. And we may never have. The darkness of the solar bodies is creepy here. Jupiter is a black void in itself, and the position of the Discovery ship looks like it is being engulfed by that blackness. And the panning down of the camera gives that familiar sensation of falling that is so often conveyed in this movie. The monolith itself is now shown alone and spinning slowly, displaying its own mysterious dark void on its featureless surface, and the stars convey falling again. The idea that the monolith is perhaps a mirror of our own universe or a gateway to another is suggested in the novelization by a key line, quote, "The thing's hollow, it goes on forever," and "oh my god, it's full of stars," end quote. To that effect, we could even say that the monolith isn't an alien intelligence at all, but merely a symbol of the great infinite unknown that we call the universe, which itself inspires us real humans to want to evolve and colonize it, even though it's terrifyingly huge and empty. I suspect that this is a common subconscious effect of the monolith for audiences, whether they're studying the film in detail or not. I mean, if the monolith is supposed to be friendly to humans and there to help them, then why is it so bloody scary? Now Jupiter looking even more like a black hole of nothingness and shown closer and therefore even bigger. Like with the Earth orbiting spaceships, our sense of orientation is all over the place here. Varying camera tilts and the Discovery being in front of Jupiter 1 minute and then behind it the next, which would be hundreds of thousands of miles away to get from one side to the other. The singing voices as part of the Ligeti music sounds to me more like the distant chorus of people who are terrified of something. At some points, they even sound like they're trying to balance on a tightrope and thus scared of falling. It's horror music really, isn't it? If you put the positive music from the Earth orbit sequence over these shots, the scary effect is reduced. Sort of. Now a stationary 90-degree rotated shot along the equator axis of Jupiter and its moons, and cut to the pod approaching, but the Discovery ship isn't behind it anymore, for some reason, and the stars are moving downwards, which makes no sense. This thing is moving directly towards us. Stars should be still. The shot here is creepy because the pod, lacking another comparative object, looks like it's growing in size rather than actually moving toward us. Now the monolith tilts, reflecting the sun before it disappears into the blackness of space. Like with the snail pace build-up to Bowman being propelled into the airlock, the snail pace of these creepy Jupiter shots both draws out our discomfort and provides a comparative reference to the high-speed Stargate journey that we're about to see. We've just panned up to where the sun should be shining, but instead the first details of the Stargate initially look like actual stars in the distance beginning to fire toward us. As the pattern increases, the actual stars disappear. The violent shaking of Bowman, which isn't matched by any shaking of his view of the tunnel itself, I think this basically conveys his sense of reality as being shaken beyond recognition, and he's squinting his eyes as if what he is seeing is too much to take. The wide-angle lens gives a space-distorting effect, and I think the crazy, unfamiliar geometric patterns are to Bowman what the unfamiliar geometric precision of the monolith itself was to the apes. Same music for both scenes, but here the music carries on much longer, and so we hear new sections of it that weren't heard before. Although the directional movement appears to be forward, I still think the creepy singing voices convey the terror of falling, and the novelization describes the sequence as falling through the monolith. A quick shot of Bowman in his helmet and he looks utterly horrified. In fact, his bluish skin makes him look dead. The length of the Stargate journey is also pretty scary, like we're trapped here, and the visual onslaught is going to go on, forever and ever and ever. The music turns into a kind of repetitive throb as the Stargate patterns start to involve repetitious elements. And bits of the hypnotic geometry play tricks on our eyes. Disorientation overload. Then an eye seen with a double colour filter. My impression of this has always been that the coloured patterns of the Stargate have somehow become a part of Bowman. They've infected him and changed the way he sees. To me, this whole Stargate thing comes off like a massive informational data download into Bowman's mind. Like he's been shown all kinds of things that no human being has ever imagined. Perhaps the underlying mathematics of the universe itself. Now that the download is complete, he sees this. I assumed in my early viewings of the film in my teens that this is a representation of the Big Bang, the creation of the universe, being that the following shots appear to show an emerging and growing cosmos with little star and planet shapes among the debris. The novel describes this as a star cluster, if I remember correctly, but I think the Big Bang interpretation is much more powerful, whether intended or not. And on top of the music, there's the distant rumble of some continuous explosion going on throughout this whole sequence. The fisheye lenses give a spatial distorting effect, keeping up the spatial disorientation throughout the entire sequence pretty much. Now a second view of Bowman's eye with different colour filter combination. The first was sky blue and yellow, and now it's sky blue and magenta. Are these colours just random, or do they have some relationship with what he's seeing? Sky blue and yellow are colours we normally associate with sunshine. And here the sky blue and magenta is followed by the same colours dominating the start of the next shot. Now what the hell are these things? Are they a variation on the monolith? If so, why are there 7 of them in this specific arrangement? Are these the aliens who made the monolith? Why the diamond shapes? Why do there seem to be inverse triangular stargates displayed on each face? When I say inverse, I mean stargates that are travelling backwards, coming outward instead of travelling through it. Why the red, transparent, landscape-like feature below? And one thing that this image does convey is that Bowman is seeing things that are unknowable to us, possibly even beyond our earthly comprehension. The music is slightly sinister as we see these things. And the rising stars give the sensation of falling, even though we seem to be hovering over a landscape. The inverse optical illusion Stargate patterns give the impression that they are absorbing information, as opposed to the Stargate giving it. And the redness of the landscape against the black void of space, that seems hellish. It feels to me like these objects are a thing to be feared for some reason. The novelization, by the way, features descriptions of the Stargate sequence that are very, very different to what we see in the film, so it's hard to tell whether the novel can be used as a reliable reference point. It includes descriptions of alien spaceships with technology way beyond man, mostly derelict alien spaceships, but there's no description of these diamond objects. There is a long description of Bowman passing over the surface of a red star, but this shot doesn't look like anything like a red star. So whatever the meaning is here, it doesn't seem to be present in the novelization. However, I do have a little observation that links between this shot and the blue sky landscape that follows. The two shots include a third insert of an eye, this time with blue and orange. The orange fills the pupil, and so it looks rather like the sun. So, given the emphasis on sunrises during moments of evolution early in the movie, maybe this eye shot represents a sunrise, thus shifting the landscape view from the dark and sinister, unstable landscape of this to the more solid-looking dawn-lit sky of this. Another Dawn of Man sequence, except with man, or Bowman, as the sun rising over the horizon, supplying our own light, as Kubrick put it. Come on, Rob, stop reading too much into this. Hey, don't worry, I'm just exploring ideas and interpretations which might prompt you to reach a more satisfying and merited interpretation of your own. If you really think the details of what you're seeing in this movie are meaningless, then you probably would have switched this video off in the first few minutes or not even watched it at all. So let's crack on. Now we get colour filtered landscape shots, lots of them, which are absent from the novelisation. The forward motion and unnatural colour conveys a continuing journey similar to the Stargate itself, but with a more familiar planetary reference. Except these landscapes look dead. No animals, no vegetation, so the sense of Bowman being completely alone continues. Once again, there's a sense of vast scale here, as occurred with the Dawn of Man sequence at the start of the movie. The highlighting of dark areas in yellows and reds, combined with occasional rumbling heard over the musical score, has always given me the impression of this world being somewhat volcanic, which is supported by the views of water in this sequence not having the rumble sound effect. This has always given me the impression of a world being created, possibly the early stages of Earth itself. Finish now with multiple colour filter variations on the human eye, which I assume to be Bowman's eye. Seems like he's cycling through multiple perceptual filters, and finally he is returned to a more stable perceptual state. It's like he's just had the most mind-blowing ultimate acid trip. And if there's one thing LSD is good for, it's making us realise how much of our normal perception of reality is in fact constructed by ourselves. Mess with the brain's sensory filtering and memory access processes, and momentary raw sensory input then becomes chaotic and unreliable. And onto the mysterious hotel room ending. Bowman looks traumatised, of course. He's just been exposed to more mind-blowing information than any other human being has ever encountered. With regards to the novelisation, my impression is that Arthur C. Clarke had been shown some of the rushes of the Stargate during the shoot and had tried to come up with a sensible interpretation for the novel, but the end result is a severe mismatch, and possibly he was shown footage that wasn't used in the film. The descriptions in the novelisation of the hotel room stuff are more interesting and probably more relevant, but they also mismatch the film in a lot of ways. The most interesting inclusion for me is that there's a TV screen in the room upon which Bowman watches footage of apes. This is in the novelisation. And I take that as Bowman reflecting on man's evolutionary journey right up to this point. In terms of the existential horror themes in this video, the timeless existence and unknown location of this room, it's unsettling in itself. While the room isn't huge, the sound effects and music consistently echo as if the room is a lot larger. And there's distant tinkering sounds and voices that sound like some external entities are tampering or speaking from outside the room. So much emphasis on colossal space in this movie. Slowly Bowman's breath fades in, as if he'd held his breath throughout the entire Stargate sequence and all the cosmos and landscape sequences that followed. At the evolutionary level, Bowman's technology, his tools gradually disappear, taking him back to a more natural state. As he grows old, he forgets his more primitive techno-dependent self, but he also keeps seeing himself for what he is becoming. And then he turns into the Star Child, the next evolutionary step, obviously. Now, I haven't gone into a lot of detail about this hotel room ending because I already offered a very detailed interpretation of it in my video 2001 A Voyage Beyond Words. That video gets into hidden narrative stuff in a way that accounts for the vast majority of details in this end scene. At the surface narrative level, reborn in quarantine, he now travels through the Dark Monolith confidently, not with fear as happened near Jupiter, not with fear as happened with the apes. Hence, this is the first time in the movie that the monolith appears without that tormentingly scary Ligeti music. Most importantly, perhaps, Bowman is no longer confined by the physical survival requirements of his own body. He can survive in space without the need for a spaceship hull. Instead, he has a protective aura generated, seemingly, by his very being, just as humans on Earth today are protected from the elements by their skin. Does this star child need to eat? Does it simply absorb energy from sunlight? It certainly seems to supply its own light, as Kubrick put it. Bowman is still alone, just as mankind may ultimately be alone in the cosmos, or at least never actually encounter another intelligent species. But he won't be alone for long, because he's back at Earth, where other human beings can be found. And perhaps he has become the human equivalent of the monolith. Why return here unless his aim is either to destroy the human race or, more likely, assist it in their mass evolution? The Strauss music essentially establishes a loop back to the beginning of the movie, so that intellectual evolution can start all over again for the next subjects. And Bowman has his eyes on you, the viewer, being that he's now so advanced he can see outside the film itself, challenging you to evolve and supply your own light. Well, there you go. That's my take on 2001 as an existential horror film of sorts. In contrast to the feel-good, we can conquer the cosmos vibes of 60s space race propaganda in the real world, 2001 frames our evolution and survival as a species against the infinite void that surrounds our little safety bubble called Earth. Most of this film is soaked in fear of the unknown, fear of isolation, fear of disorientation, fear of lost gravity, fear of darkness, to the point that I now think of it as being as much a psychological horror as it is science fiction. But unlike most horror films, the destination here is a very positive one. The film is encouraging us to face the great black void and fill it with our own light. It isn't promising an easy journey though. So, have you, watching this video, turned into a star child or monolith yet? What you have? Well then do share the love, because there's a lot of struggling, isolated apes out there craving an intellectual and inspirational boost, especially during this fearful and likely overreactive coronavirus lockdown at the time of me posting this video. If you're new to my work and you want to take the next small step, giant leap up the ladder of 2001: A Space Odyssey engagement, then make sure to check out my video, The Meaning of the Monolith Revealed. It's here on YouTube, that one. Or go read the extensive written analysis of the film on my website. These two sources, linked in the video description below, go beyond the surface alien intervention of human evolution narrative and get into 2001's even deeper levels of cinematic sophistication, which were an evolutionary leap in the art of cinema when the film was released, and frankly still dwarf the competition today. Thanks for watching. You've been listening to Rob Ager. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there's more videos like this coming soon. Check out my website for the freebies there, which includes several long analysis articles on Kubrick films. If I eventually evolve beyond earning a living, then all my vids will be for free. But in the meantime, if you buy some of my digital video downloads or support me on Patreon, then you can help me get a lot more content out there for free. Bye for now, folks. We'll meet again.